My mother liked to sleep around. Submitted by Head of Spectre. I won't pretend that Catherine Lawrence was the greatest mother. With all of the drinking, the late nights, and the strange men in her life, I'd say that I spent more time raising my siblings than she did. But I could never quite hate her for that. No, she wasn't a good parent, but despite her flaws, I loved her up until the end. Dying surrounded by family and loved ones is what everyone seems to strive for, and our mother succeeded in that much. Before us, she'd been alone. No family to speak of, no living parents or grandparents, brothers or sisters. No one. Mom didn't often talk about her life, but my understanding was she'd been orphaned when she was young. It had always been just her against the world. Maybe that explained why she slept around so much. Maybe she was afraid the men in her life would abandon her, so she abandoned them first. Maybe she just liked being the center of attention during a new romance, or maybe it was something else entirely. In 32 years of life, I never once thought to ask, and even if I had, I doubt I'd ever have gotten a legitimate answer. My mother kept a lot of things to herself, and there were parts of her she'd never share with anyone. I understand that now more than I ever did. She was 57 when she died, and I'd still say she died young. Before cancer wore her down, she could have still passed for being in her 30s with her long dark hair and reserved demeanor. I'd always thought she'd end up outliving all of us, given how healthy she'd been. She'd worked blue collar all her life, mostly construction, and it had left her with a surprising strength. That woman didn't look like much, but if she hit you, you'd still feel it the day after the next. That said, she was also a lifelong smoker, and when that caught up to her there wasn't a damn thing anyone could do to stop it. She'd spent the last few years of her life fighting for her life, staying with my brother Lucas who helped her as much as he could during her decline. Cancer might just be the cruelest way to die. The way it shreds a person down until they're just a shell is nothing short of horrifying to watch. I visited Mom and Lucas as much as I could, and each time, a little more of her was missing. When the end came, it was almost mercy. Her death didn't come as a surprise. We'd had years to prepare, and during her final days in hospice, Lucas and I made sure that the family was all together. Mom had grown up alone in this world, but we wanted to make damn sure she didn't die alone. There were 8 of us. The family resemblance was hard to see sometimes. Most of us have come from different absent fathers, scattered around different parts of the country, but we were all hers. As the oldest, I'd helped raise just about all of them. I can't imagine our family dynamic was the healthiest, but I know that most of my siblings look at me almost like a father figure, and I do my best to be there for them. Lucas had made space for us at his place. 8 people, plus Lucas' family, was a lot, but we made do. They only allowed a handful of people by her bedside, so during those final hours, most of them waited at his place as Lucas, myself, and our sister Nancy stayed at her bedside saying our goodbyes. When she flatlined, it was sudden and without ceremony. She died in her sleep. 1 minute she was there, the next she was gone and the room remained silent. The funeral was nice, but there were only a few of us there. The 8 of us and our families. Since it was just us, there really wasn't much of a reception. We'd gone back to Lucas' house and sat around in his backyard under the indifferent May sun. As I stood on his deck, looking out at my siblings and their families, I felt a tragic sort of nostalgia. It had been years since we'd all been together. I'd watched most of these people grow up for my entire life. As the oldest, that was my duty. Lucas had been her second son. At 30, he'd done all right for himself, and he stood beside me, watching all sorts of familiar faces in his backyard with a pair of beers in hands. At a glance, you might not have guessed that Lucas and I were brothers. He had dark hair and darker skin. I was as white and blonde as they came. As I said before, our mother slept around. The men in her life would stay for only a few months before she'd moved on. Then, more often than not, we'd find ourselves with a new sibling on the way soon after. "Hate to see the gang back together under these circumstances," he'd said. His voice was quiet and grim. "Yeah. At least we knew it was coming," I said. "Awful as it is, we should all be so lucky." He offered me an open beer, and I took a swig. In the back of my mind, I remembered the first time I'd had a beer with Lucas. Mom had been out, and we'd just gone through her fridge. I'd been about 15 back then. He'd been terrified she'd somehow find out, but she never did. The memory almost made me crack a smile. "Are you heading to the house tomorrow?" he asked. There was hesitation in his voice. I took a sip of the beer and nodded. "Yeah. Might as well get a head start on cleaning it out. I'm sure there's things we'd like to keep." For sure, for sure. Let me know what you find," he said. I saw a ghost of a smile cross Lucas' face. You know, it's funny, back when we moved in, that house scared the shit out of me. I was still like, I don't know, what? 10? 11? You remember how I had that room by the kitchen? Yeah, with Jack and Kyle, I said. My eyes flitted to those two siblings in question, both in their mid-20s and starting their careers after college. At that moment, they leaned on the fence at the far side of the yard, probably having a conversation not too dissimilar to the one I was having with Lucas. I used to think that house was haunted. I could hear the house settling some nights. The spot I was in, right in the corner, just banged and groaned constantly. If that house had a basement, I would have thought something was living down there. Might have been an animal under the foundation, I suggested. The mention of a basement made me pause to think for a moment. Did any of the houses we lived in have basements? Lucas paused. I don't think so. Maybe the one in Kentucky? I think there was a window near the backyard, but you couldn't see anything through it. Mom said they'd filled it in. I shook my head and took another sip of my beer. Weird. Lucas nodded in agreement before he gave me a pat on the shoulder and left me on his porch. Mom's house wasn't as big as you might expect a house that raised 8 kids to be. It was a ranch-style house that sat on an unassuming suburban street. The exterior was a little more rundown than the others. No one had really taken much care of it over the past few years, and just like Mom, it had deteriorated. The driveway was empty as I pulled my rented truck out front. I still had my key, and I knew that going through her things would take a few days. Lucas would be along to help me after most of the rest of our siblings went back home. The house didn't need all of us in it again. A musty smell invaded my nostrils as I set foot inside that house again. The floorboards creaked under my weight. Lucas had only provided minimal upkeep to the place while Mom had been with him. He'd had more pressing concerns. I'd brought a few cardboard boxes with me and figured I'd start with the kitchen. If there was any food left in there, it probably needed to be thrown out. Otherwise, I could probably take stock of the appliances. The ones in better shape could be sold. I was a little surprised to find that the house still had power when I tried the lights, although I noticed the fridge had been unplugged and emptied. There were a few perishables left in the pantry, but not many. What was left was covered in dust and rat shit, meaning it was definitely trash, so I focused first on getting rid of those. Mom's kitchen barely had room for all of us. Space had always been a bit of an issue. When we were younger, we'd slept in bunk beds and shared rooms. Privacy wasn't much of a concept, but Mom didn't seem interested in stopping anytime soon. She'd kept having kids, or at least trying to. The 8 of us were the ones who'd gotten to grow up. One of our siblings had been stillborn, 2 had been miscarried, and 1 had died in the crib. We'd moved every few years, although I couldn't say why. Mom said she got bored of her surroundings. We'd lived in several different states: Texas, Washington, Louisiana, Oregon, and Kentucky, and I didn't even remember which state I'd been born in. As I emptied the pantry, I let myself reminisce on old houses and good memories. I cleared out the top pantry first before I moved to her little walk-in. It was shallow, and I remembered she'd put it up herself shortly after we'd moved. It sat in one corner of the kitchen, and it held sturdy. Mom had always told us not to go fishing through it since she was afraid it might collapse on us, but I can't see why. She'd clearly known what she was doing. Still, she'd once blown up and screamed at Lucas when she caught him looking through it. There were fewer perishables in there, so I spent less time cleaning it out. I went from top to bottom, picking out everything and dropping it into a fresh garbage bag. Most of them were old soups that 0 out of 8 kids wanted to eat. I had no idea why Mom bought them. I spotted the corner of one can near the back and reached in to grab it. My finger brushed something cold and metal as I did. For a moment, I thought it was another can, but it felt different. I didn't think too much of it and reached back in to get it. Whatever it was round and smooth. I tried to tug it, but it wouldn't budge. It jiggled though, almost like a doorknob or something, but there was no way in hell she'd keep a doorknob in the pantry. I bent down, peeking into the dim light, but my senses hadn't been deceiving me. What I'd felt was definitely a doorknob. It sat near the edge of the pantry, as if the whole thing was meant to cover up a door. I turned the knob and pulled. The entire pantry opened towards me. The hinges creaked a bit, and I watched in confusion as the door the pantry had been built over opened up. I stared at it for a moment, a little dumbstruck. How the hell had that been there for so long, and I'd never noticed it? My eyes shifted downwards towards what lay behind the door, and I saw stairs leading downwards into a basement. I stared at them in quiet disbelief before I approached the stairs. They were concrete and sturdy, which hopefully meant they were safe enough to walk on. I took my first step down and began my descent. Why the hell had Mom hidden the basement from us? This didn't make any sense. What could she possibly have to hide down there? I knew I'd get my answer soon enough. At the bottom of the stairs was another door. It was open, although it looked as if it was designed to be locked from the outside. I only lingered on the door for a few moments. What interested me the most was what was beyond it. The room on the other side was bare cement. I saw bricks where basement windows had once been and an old metal cot with a moldy old mattress in one corner. It stank of mildew. Standing in that room made me feel claustrophobic, and yet as I looked around, I felt my pulse begin to race. What the fuck had Mom been doing down there? That room was clearly meant for someone to live in. I think. Although it seemed more like a torture cell than anything else. My eyes were drawn to the concrete walls. I could see scratches in them, near where the windows had been. Dark rusty smears were near one of the windows as if someone had tried to dig their way through the mortar, and they'd worn their fingers away to bloody nubs in the process. My heart raced as I stared at them. I felt dizzy and uncomfortable. I felt like the walls were closing in on me, and I backed towards the door immediately. I half expected it to slam shut and lock behind me, but thankfully it didn't. I ran up the concrete stairs and burst out into the silent safety of the kitchen. My hands were shaking. My skin had gone whiter. I didn't know what I'd seen, not really. Part of me didn't want to know. Part of me wanted to let Mom take that one last horrible secret to her grave. But I knew I needed answers. I wish I could have let it be. But I needed answers. I didn't tell Lucas about what I found, not immediately. I didn't even go back to his place. Instead, I just found a place to sit quietly as I wrote down things I remembered, like our old addresses. It took a bit of research to find the phone numbers for the most recent occupants, but I had all afternoon. I remembered what Lucas had said about the house in Kentucky, how he'd seen a basement window. How Mom had said, it was filled in. I wondered who'd filled it in. Naturally, I started with Kentucky. The man who'd answered the phone had a pleasant accent, and he answered my questions about the basement, and as he spoke, my body felt colder and colder. He said that the door to the basement was at the back of a closet. It had been unfinished, and the windows had been bricked up. He said nothing about supposed blood smears or an old bed frame. I can't imagine Mom would have left anything too incriminating behind. I got a similar answer when I called our old house in Oregon, although the homeowners weren't nearly as polite. I didn't want to call anyone else. I didn't have it in me to go through each and every old house. I was born in Idaho in 1987. I never met my father. Mom told me that his name was Malcolm Donaldson. Malcolm. She'd even named me after him. I looked him up once and didn't find much. Strangers, politicians, nobody who it made sense to reach out to. Way at the bottom of the list, though, was a man named Malcolm Donaldson who'd disappeared in late 1986, a few towns over from where Mom had lived when I'd been born. I might not have gone through all the addresses, but I looked up the name of every man I remembered Mom bringing home. I've found most of them. Or at least reports on most of them. The reports say they're either missing or dead. For the ones they found, the cause of death was almost always starvation. I'm not sure why Mom chose that. Letting people waste away alone in the dark. I'm not sure about anything anymore. I don't know what I'm going to tell my siblings. This is all too much to process. It's not that Mom was a serial killer. No. No, as horrible as that is, I find that I can accept that. I can even accept the fact that what she did to her victims was nothing short of sadistic. The part I can't process. The part I can't accept is the fact that now, I know what we were to her. She didn't have us because she wanted us or even because she was too stupid to use a condom. No. We were mementos of her sick crimes. Fond reminders of the atrocities she'd committed. We were trophies,